I see a lot of people on the internet showing off their mudskipper tanks with sand substrates, but that's actually not the best option for mudskippers. Biologists who study mudskippers generally agree that mud is the best substrate to use for keeping them in captivity. Sand can irritate mudskippers' skin, and they also can't burrow in sand. Now, burrowing is an important behavior of mudskippers in the wild. It makes them feel safe, and it's also how they breed. So if mudskippers can't burrow, that means that they will be more territorial and stressed in general. So mud can come from a riverbank. You can collect it and then sanitize it and use that in your mudskipper tank, or you can make a artificial mixture. So today I'm going to make that artificial mixture and show you all the steps I take. The first step here is to plan how the paludarium will be structured. The size of the enclosure will depend on the species of mudskipper you're planning to keep. I'm planning to adopt 3 Periophthalmus barbarus, which are normally called Atlantic or African mudskippers. These guys can get up to 9 inches long. They are bigger and more territorial than most species, so I've got a 75-gallon tank that I'll set them up with. The other most common type of mudskipper that is kept as a pet is called the Indian mudskipper or the Pierce's mudskipper. These guys are much smaller, so you can probably keep more of them in a tank together or use a smaller tank. At low tide, there should be at least 70% or so of the tank that is above water. I'll go over how the tide should work in another video, but for planning the mud, we only need to consider the low tide. The water should be shallow enough that the mudskippers can lay flat without being totally submerged. The most common setup is to slope the mud up from one end of the tank to the other, kind of like a riverbank or a seashore. Ideally, the mud should be at least 6 inches deep at all points so that they have plenty of room to burrow. To make the mud, I'm following a specific recipe that I'll leave in the description. Basically, we're mixing Zoo-Med ReptiSoil with a mixture of powder clays and then getting that wet with brackish water in order to make it mud. The goal is that they can burrow in the mud and it'll hold its shape. Obviously, you don't want them to burrow down and then have everything collapse down on them, so it needs to be able to hold shape. And the only thing to note here is that the Custer Feldspar is a specific kind of clay that I don't think is in production anymore. So for today, we're just gonna skip that part and we'll see what happens. For the mixture today, I've got 2 24-quart bags of Zoo-Med ReptiSoil, 50 pounds of Gold Art clay, 50 pounds of Hawthorn Bond clay, and 15 pounds of Old Mine No. 4 clay. I weighed the ReptiSoil bags to be roughly 35 pounds combined. Taking the ratios from the formula and accounting for the missing Custer Feldspar, this means I'll plan to use roughly 45 pounds each of Gold Art and Hawthorn Bond, and all 15 pounds of the Old Mine No. 4. These are rough values, and I don't plan to weigh the quantities I'm using. I'll just empty the 50-pound bags until there's a bit left and then stop. I started out pouring 1 bag of ReptiSoil in my cart. Then I poured all the clay on top of that. My idea was to kind of make a clay sandwich with soil on top and bottom and then mix all that together. I ran into an issue because my cart wasn't big enough to comfortably hold all of that at once, and the wind was blowing, so I was worried about losing my materials. I ran to the shed and grabbed some extra bins I had laying around. I tried to rinse them off first, but I didn't exactly use my thinking cap. There you go. I used these to hold some overflow while I mixed the rest. Eventually I saw that the mixture was mostly one consistent color, so it was time to add some brackish water. Again, I was spilling a bit, so I used an overflow bin. You don't want to overdo it with the water. For this whole mixture, I only used about 5 to 6 gallons of water. You want it to ultimately be a cohesive collection of mud, not runny at all. I had to go digging at the bottom of the cart where the soil and clay were sitting unmixed. I took my time to really make sure everything was mixed together well. Eventually I was ready to start bringing the mud into the tank. This mud is super heavy. I would not recommend trying to dump it from a full bucket, or else, well... After I cleared out the broken pieces of my fake rock, I decided scooping from the bucket was a better plan. I figured out that the mud sticks together so well that you can just use 2 hands to hold a big clump and it won't drip or anything like that. Eventually I finished adding all the mud to the tank and I realized I did not make nearly enough. I cut my tidal input hole a little higher than I planned to, and I don't think I used the right measurements when I estimated how much mud I would need months ago. I'll need another batch of this amount of mud to finish. I definitely learned a few things through the process of making this mud. The mud is really heavy and it sticks together really well, so it's pretty hard to mix and move around. Also, the whole process was really messy. My fiance would have been pissed at me if I hadn't thought to lay down a tarp on the ground in the house before I started with all this. It's important to accurately estimate how much material you're going to need before you start, or else you're going to end up like me, and now I have to sit and wait for more materials to be delivered to be able to finish. And the good news is that the mud itself came out great. It sticks together really well, so I think the skipper's burrows will definitely hold. If you found this video interesting, you should definitely subscribe. Next, I'm going to be making a video about how I'm going to simulate the tides in this tank using a custom programmed Arduino. So until then, take care.